Welcome, everybody. My name's Alicia Davis. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Turing AI Special Interest Group, Clinical AI Special Interest Group, with Joe and Nick and Emma as well too, who are with you. And we're absolutely delighted to have Dom Pimenta from Tortus with us today as well to talk to you all. We don't have any announcements at the start. We've got about an hour, so we'll have a presentation from Dom, and then there's lots of time for questions. You can pop questions as we're going in the chat if you like, and then we'll gather those up and have a bit of a discussion towards the end. It's going to be just a really, really interesting, really excited to hear what Dom has to say. Today's focus is about ambient scribes and the potential that they have to be a really powerful tool for good in the NHS, acting as assistants and helping to improve maybe patient safety into the future as well too. And Tortus has been really leading the way here in the UK, particularly strong commitment to scientific rigour and patient safety and driven by clinicians, so clinician-led design. Dom is Dom Pimenta is the CEO and a co-founder of Tortus AI, and is going to be talking to us about their recent paper published in Nature, which is all about assessing the clinical safety and hallucinations rates for large language models in medical text summation. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Dom. I think you've got your slides, so you're navigating, and I'm really delighted. So welcome.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Alicia, for that super kind intro. And also thanks for having me back on. I think the last time I was here, I was like super jet lagged in the US. So hopefully I can be a little more coherent. Yes, so I'm Dr. Dom Pimenta. I'm CEO and co-founder of Tortus. I'm an internal medicine physician and cardiologist, so practicing a wee bit. And today we will talk about some of the, well, very deeply on the technical safety side of what we do and how we do it, and mostly focused on our recent paper, which was in Nature Digital Medicine a couple of months ago. So before we get into things, why? Why is this important? So Tortoise actually started as an angry email, as most potential NHS projects do. This is from 2017 now, so about 8 years ago. I wrote to Cerner and I said, I have used PowerChart for a couple of years, but compared to traditional paper notes, it has several drawbacks, namely the practical workflow of a ward round is heavily impeded, which is a very polite way of saying it was in the way, it's super high friction, and it's a pain that we all kind of know. So the idea for Tortoise is that we are trying to solve that friction point, right? We're trying to build an AI interface that sits over the AHR, allows clinicians that human-to-human interaction, what we train to do, and takes away as much of the administrative burden as possible. As we all know, the ambient voice technology now pretty well used, at least known about in many systems. That's where we'll start, and that's the focus of this paper. But the idea over time is to use AI to do many, many different tasks, all of which fundamentally, actually, if they're LLM powered, will be prone to the same risks around that technology, specifically around hallucination. So this was our paper that we published a few months ago now, a practical framework to measure and reduce large language model hallucinations and emissions in clinical notes with the clinician loop safety scoring. And thanks to all our authors, Schellers past and present. So what we'll go through in this paper, and I'll put a link in it after the presentation, is essentially 4 novel elements that we are sort of introducing into the literature with this particular study. Number 1, an error taxonomy. So when we first started, we didn't actually have definitions for how to define what a clinical hallucination is and what a clinical emission is. But maybe more importantly, the major and minor criteria of risk, the breakdown of the 4 subtypes, and why that's important in this specific context. I very firmly believe that the evaluation of an AI technology is inherently tied to the use case and almost pointless controversial statement, to evaluate models in the general sense when actually you need to be generating specific error thesis around your specific task. We talk about iterative experimental design, and that's quite interesting from a sort of instruction fine-tuning. So if you talk about the performance of a model, we talk about prompt model pairs and hardware as well, but that's a slightly separate triplicate. And we can show a little bit how the system was benefited by iterative and how that does actually work. And then clinical safety. So what we did here was we combined the existing, many of you guys will be clinical safety officers, so use the clinical safety officer taxonomy of risk and applied it specifically to this task to help us risk assess these systems. And then we can talk a little bit about clinician in the loop, the role of clinicians increasingly in a world where data is driving the performance of models, and our contribution to that system, which we called CREOLA. I will take questions as we go. How do you risk assess the systems? Yeah, I might actually come back to questions at the end because obviously that's part of the presentation. Okay, so let's start then with taxonomy. So as I said, when we very first started looking at this space nearly 3 years ago now, it wasn't super clear how to define what an error actually was. So we came up with this problem. Now, a summarization task normally is, in a general sense, you kind of want all the information, irregardless of one source, in a second with some reasonable level of conciseness. In a clinical conversation, you don't want that at all. What is the pertinent details in that conversation is contextually specific. So, for example, a dietitian asking a patient about their favorite flavor of crisps is very relevant to that dietitian's ultimate note because that's part of their plan. An orthopedic surgeon asking about the flavor of crisps while you wait for an X-ray is completely irrelevant in the context of a knee replacement, for example. So omissions, or when information is missing from one source and not present in the other, are actually quite subjective. And when we talk about hallucinations, in the one sense, that's quite straightforward. Information that appears in the note that's not somehow meaningfully entailed into the transcript is a confabulation or a hallucination, and then we term that in this parlance as a false positive. But also it can be much more subtle. And we talk about some of the subtleties around detecting hallucinations, which then became part of this taxonomy. So we came up with this confusion matrix for this specific task, looking at the note as the output, so the medical note, which is the output of most ABT systems, and the input is the transcript audio. Now, actually, today that transcript audio is a bit more multimodal. There's other ways of ingesting patient data, contextual information that the physician has written, but this is still the fundamental. If it's present in the transcript and present in the note, that's a true positive. If it's present in the transcript but absent in the note, that's a false negative, and that's what we would term an omission in this sense. If it's present in the note as a fact, but factually missing from the transcript, or maybe more accurately, not meaningfully entailed, that's a false positive. And if it's missing from both, that's a true negative, that's an infinite space, and we ignore that. And then what we can do from that, is then calculate a precision, which is essentially the false positive rate in the inverse, and a recall. And that's how we will talk about those specific types of errors for the remainder of this paper and this presentation. We can go a little bit deeper. So when we then start talking about clinical errors, we can first risk classify them. So we came up with a very simple major and minor criteria for how we want to define these types of errors. A major error, if left uncorrected, would be likely, to have a downstream impact on the diagnosis, treatment, or management of the patient. So a new diagnosis that is then ingested into the record would then meaningfully change the downstream task in the context of that patient. A minor error, if left uncorrected, that error would likely to have an impact, or would be unlikely, to have an impact on the diagnosis, treatment, or management of that patient. And we can talk a little bit about some examples of that. And then we can also talk about the different types, and this is more specific to hallucination types. So fabrications, when the model produces information that was not available in the transcript. That's a straightforward example of a confabulation or hallucination. A negation. So the model might say a clinical fact didn't happen when it was actually stated. And allergies mishandling is a very classic and very dangerous example of that. No allergies written by the model hallucinated from actually the allergies weren't mentioned per se. And mixing up those two things, a confirmation of no allergies versus the absence of discussion, is another critical error type. Causality. So we've seen models behave where they will assign breathlessness due to X when X wasn't actually discussed. It was inferred from that conversation. And that's a different type of hallucination. Obviously, breathlessness due to heart failure, breathlessness due to pneumonia, very different treatment, potentially a major error. And then contextual. So when the model mixes topics that are otherwise not related. So for example, mixing up the presenting complaint with the history, the past medical history of the patient and conflating those two things. People are putting questions in the chat. I will come back to them and answer them all at the end. Okay, so then what we did is we took 450 note pairs. We used the Primark data set, which is a published literature data set. I think it was originally produced by Babylon, and it's all primary care consultations. It's audio and transcripts. This was our parameter settings. We took that data set, generated the outputs. We then had human clinicians, and we'll talk about this later, using our taxonomy system, label those outputs for hallucinations and emissions. That was then passed to a consolidator. So I was one of the consolidators, and so was my colleague, Dr. Asghari. And then we analyzed those results. And then we continuously looped through this process to see the types of hallucinations that were being produced. This is sort of going back about 2 years now. So we were using GPT-4 32K. And B, if iterative performance of the instruction fine-tuning, as in making the prompts better, could actually improve those numbers. So these are our final sort of analysis numbers, 450 note pairs across multiple different generations, nearly 13,000 note sentences, and nearly 50,000 transcript sentences. And these are some of our initial results. So overall, the hallucination rate, and this is again going back to 2 years ago, so you have to take that with a pinch of salt in terms of model performance, about 1.47%. So if you look here, like there's a sort of vary across different prompts, so each of these are what we call a different experiment with the different prompts and very varying numbers of hallucinations in each different type of experiment that we ran, with percentages ranging from the close to zero to extremely high in some circumstances, showing that the prompt really does make a big difference to these type of hallucinations. And then we talked about hallucination types. So here we've got classification of major and minor. Fabrications, that's your typical made something up type hallucination. The majority were major, as in they were critical potentially to the diagnostic treatment or management of that patient. The next commonest was the negations, so mixing up when facts were stated or not stated, contextual, and then causality, which uncommon but also potentially major. And what was very interesting about this finding, and I think there's a very obvious reason why, most of the hallucinations were actually in the assessment and plan section. That's the highest risk area. And you can kind of imagine why. So the model obviously is reinforced. Their reward functions that they give a complete note. Notes with are missing assessment and plan sections are much more likely to be rewarded for completing. And in fact, there was a recent paper about uncertainty versus the reward function for giving complete answers. That is a massive driver of hallucinations. And our results are very much in line with that, where the plan and the assessment areas where you really have to focus and seeing very high incidences of hallucinations relative to every other type. We also had emissions, so 3.45% emissions. I would say overall, though, that emissions are quite subjective and quite difficult to analyze. And therefore, we can come back to some of our research on that later. So then we looked at how do we take these hallucinations and emissions and start to think about a more deeper way of classifying them in terms of harm. Sorry, someone needs to get the mic on. So this, you may recognize, is the clinical safety assessment tool that's used if you've ever done a hazard log or worked on DTAC or DCBA 129. We classify harm into catastrophic, major, considerable, significant, or minor. Obviously, catastrophic is death, major is permanent life-changing capacity, etc., etc. And then we derive from this the probability of harm based on the incidences of the percentages of the findings that we had. So 90% was very, very high likelihood, 2% was very low likelihood. And then from that, you can create a confusion matrix which we've seen and you may recognize from many of your hazard log docs, with a classification of those error types, all the way from 5 being the overall highest and worst type of error to 1, which is very low likelihood and minor. And you'll see the sweet spot for most healthcare IT systems is probably allowing a residual risk of around 2. And that's the target that actually we use internally. So when we looked back then at our major hallucinations and we classified them on this scale, we found no types of the highest risk type, but pretty significant risk of significant harm with the majority between 2 and 4. And if you remember, that was very much in this section over here, which goes to show that even in this sort of relatively simulated environment, when you look really hard at these types of things, if left uncorrected, this is a potentially quite dangerous technology. And some of this research really underpins why we made the very early decision to become a medical device, because the evidence is actually quite clear that this is a technology, when it goes wrong, it can cause significant harm, potentially. And then we looked again at the different types of hallucinations, classifying them on risk, but also then subclassifying them on the different types. So the fabricated, generally not that many sort of in the major risk category, but quite significant and insignificant. The negation's interestingly much higher risk, and that's because that slight inversion of no chest pain versus chest pain can fundamentally change your clinical practice. Causality, not so much, and then contextual, relatively low risk and not that important, which you can kind of understand actually from the description. And again, we saw the highest risk in the plan and assessment areas, and that's probably to be really thoughtful about any AI-generated system where the plan and assessment is not directly entailed from what you said can potentially cause significant errors at a significant rate. We also took a look at the different emission types, relatively not as risk important to the patient and the endpoint, but there certainly were quite a few that were in that significant category, very few that were in the major or even considerable. And again, I think overall emissions are an order of magnitude less important than hallucinations when you're trying to control for different errors. And there are many, many different solutions to this, but often it is a trade-off in terms of, you improve the hallucination rate, you might increase the emission rate, but actually the trade-off is very much in favor that the controlling for hallucinations is critical. And then what we did is we demonstrated the iterative prompt design. So with no other changes to the parameters of the model, but just changing the prompts sequentially over time, rerunning it through the system, 150 clinicians, hand labeling the output, so relatively laborious and quite a lot of work, 2 to 3 weeks per cycle, can demonstrate that in experiment 3, one prompt, same data, reduced it down to the next prompt, experiment 8, and very significant drops of hallucinations. Same thing with emissions, kind of demonstrating that iterative prompt design does actually have some meaningful impact. Lastly, let's talk about CREOLA. So CREOLA is named after CREOLA Katherine Johnson. For those of you who know that is, she's the subject of the movie Hidden Fingers. She was one of the human computers, as they were termed, in the 1960s that helped do the calculations by hand for the Apollo moon landings. Then we took that and created an acronym because we love acronyms, Clinical Research and Evaluation of LLMs and AI. But fundamentally what it is, it's very similar to the idea of Mechanical Turk. You essentially take an online platform. We had about 150 clinicians, I think, at peak, who would hand label it. They were presented with a text like this, and their job was essentially to find the hallucinations, to click yes, no, and then that's how we collected all that data. And that's how we generated much of the research underpinning this system today. Now, that doesn't scale. So if you could imagine that every time you needed to iterate or design a new prompt system, you had to run a human in the loop system. A, you couldn't do that in production, and B, you couldn't really do that very quickly to actually iterate, especially at the speed that we're working at the moment. So what we did is we took that human in the loop system, developed and cross-validated an AI system instead, reduced that lead time initially from about 2 or 3 weeks to about 4 or 5 minutes. And today that whole system now runs in a couple of seconds. And it actually runs on every single note that Tortus generates. So based on that data and that course, we now have a system live in production. If you come to Tortus HQ and to message me afterwards, you can all have a visit. it's on the wall, and we can see the live hallucination rate and emission rate of every note that passes through the system. And that's how we developed and cross-validated it. And that's the next sort of step of research that we'll be publishing in due course. I've actually finished way earlier than I was planning to, probably because I didn't stop for questions like I should have done. But let me go through some questions. So if we go to the chat, he says, now being able to see the chat. Yes, okay, so let's start from the top end. We've just started with Cerner. Okay, that's not a question. How do you risk assess systems? I think we covered that. How do you calculate assess true negatives? Yes, it's an infinite number, so we just omit that, and that's how we calculate precision and recall. How hallucinations are corrected? Yeah, super interesting question. So we've built an observable system. It took us a long time to figure out how to observe and how to cross-validate that, and we had to do a lot of very laborious hand labeling, like months and months of hand labeling of data to be able to produce something which was credible and could cross-validate that. Who is liable for the medical errors? As a medical device, we are. But part of our intended use is that clinicians check the outputs. Now, the consequence of that, as we all know, is reliance bias. If we present to you as a clinician, the first time you're going to check it. The 1,000th time, are you going to check it with the same vigilance? The 10,000th time? Probably not. So over time, we have to continuously evolve our system now that we're at scale to be able to keep up with that increasing use. I sit on all the hazard log boards for all our different sites at the moment, and increasingly we come up with the same concept. It's very similar to like hand hygiene. So, Semmelweis talked about hand hygiene 300 years ago, and we still put posters on the wall every day, wash your hands. It's actually going to be very similar working alongside AI. These are features of the system. They actually aren't bugs. Large language models will hallucinate, and that is a part of how they work. So you have to cross-validate the outputs of every AI system that you use, and that will be the responsible the clinician. I can't see that changing for quite some time. And the concept of that is, we have pop-ups that pop up every day, check the outputs and be careful of that. But I think it is shared liability, and that's the nature of being a medical device. I can see Stuart on the call actually, so maybe we can talk about that if we have time and how we're handling that at some of the places. And there's a few people talking about that. Fantastic. How the AI model provide diagnosis and treatment for rare disease, the outliers. So by design, the system that we have today, it doesn't. So if you've mentioned something in the transcript or in the note, or you've thought about it and you said it out loud, there's a meaningful source that's entailed. The model by design and all the guardrails now that we have in the system, sort of even beyond the scope of this paper, should not be suggesting new diagnoses that weren't mentioned, treatment of diseases that weren't mentioned. Now we take the observability system, which now runs in a few seconds, and we're already starting to work on systems to actively intervene. And that means if we find something with low confidence of entailment, as in it doesn't exist in the input, we remove it. And that's sort of the next layer to be able to do that. There are other future evolutions of architecture, probably actually way beyond the scope and definitely into IP land, so I'm not going to talk about, where this wouldn't be such a problem at all. And entailment, just as a way that you or I will always know if we're taking notes from a patient where that's come from. Well, there's an interesting question about human baseline, and again, we can come on to that. Would always have that sort of capability of something that was grounded in truth. But for today, we are very deliberate, and most companies should be very deliberate about not even trying to ask the model for this, because it's almost impossible from a verification perspective anyway, and certainly under the ideas of medical device. Connor asks, have you undertaken any analysis on the impact of updating the underlying frontier LLM to the performance without retraining? I think the question being asked there is how do we keep up? So actually, the reason we built the system in the first place, it was a very commercial reason. We had to be able to constantly reevaluate the new models for performance. We had to have an architecture that was a number that we knew that we were getting better, whether that was the prompt or the models. As I said at the top of the call, you should always think about it as a prompt model pair. The prompt is extremely important. You'll see countless papers in the literature. They've just tried one prompt across lots of models and they've called that model performance. I think fundamentally from our research and from our experience, that is an extremely flawed approach. There are now very sort of standardized methodologies for improving prompts against metrics. So you have to have the metrics to make sure that your prompts are improving, and then you can actually evaluate model performance. I'd also argue that for this particular task or for any specific task, the literature is increasingly pointing towards small models actually being more performant if they're fine-tuned and focused again on those metrics. So the key part is having the metrics, being able to automate and to be observable, and then you can agilely move between multiple different models. And today we use lots and lots all simultaneously. But you have to have that core validation metric against which you are trying to improve something meaningfully. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to get anywhere. And it's the same thing for any test-driven development suite system. Two questions from M. Ahmed. No AI scribe is 100% accurate and safe. Therefore, even a single error could have catastrophic impacts. How are you managing these? Yeah, so as a medical device, intended and used to the clinician to make sure that they review and actively, it might be worth actually bringing Stuart in a little bit to talk about that. If you're willing to join, I know you're just here as an
Yeah,
observer.
no, I can join. Shall I introduce myself? I thought I would say Stuart Kyle. I'm a rheumatologist, but clinical lead for outpatient transformation at RDUH, and we went live with Tortus integrated fully within Epic yesterday, and is going well to date. I mean, we put guardrails into our training, and we took this in quite a lot of detail through our clinical safety risk, and we have a daily pop-up and I can't remember, I was at a conference, it was a British Society of Rheumatology one, and someone stood up and said AI, and it was someone from the Turing Institute, said AI generates inference, doctors generate facts. And I think that's a really good mantra to sort of live by, that this is a tool to help facilitate us. We need to be checking it, and we have daily, pop-ups. The reliance bias, as Dom said, we're aware of it. We're looking at possibly some ways that we might see how much our clinical staff are scanning and looking back at documents. So we're thinking of ways and collaborating, working with universities and things, whether we can do a bit of work looking at this. But that's what we put into place to date.
Cool. Thanks so much, Stuart. And then also hearing about the Denise on the demise of AI scribes due to the plethora of companies. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to talk about commoditization. It's slightly off topic here, but I just comment on it very briefly. AI scribes are not the breakthrough here. They're not the paradigm. The paradigm shift is that the computer understands what is happening without being told. And you can debate all day about the concept of understanding, but the idea here is like you are just feeding audio into a system and is contextually writing a note for you. It could also be writing an audit or a code or a documentation or doing a task or 100 other downstream things. But essentially, that bipartite relationship of patient and clinician is now becoming a tripartite one. There is an AI in the room that is listening. That is the critical change. Now, what that AI does over time will be a question of regulatory productivity, how much EHR, guardrailing, and gatekeeping, and all sorts of commercial fun. And I can talk to you all about how we tackle that. But I think the fundamental academic change is that we need to learn to work alongside AI. That AI has to be held to the same clinical standard as every other medical device and every other medical professional, probably in the limit, in terms of you say what you do what you say, right? And that is the struggle, really. And that kind of highlights why this type of research is quite important. Models themselves have no concept of truth. Why would they? Whereas we are inherently held to that account. And that's the friction that we kind of have to solve by working alongside these systems. Yeah, talk to me all about commercials at some point. Can you say more about the decision to become a medical device? How does a medical device labeling mitigate any risks? It's not about the mitigation, it's about the philosophy. So when you're a medical device, especially, class one is self-certification. Again, I'll comment on what I think about that. But class two, you have to submit, somebody else shares the medical legal liability. You say it has this performance, somebody else says it does have this performance, and you share the liability for that performance being the actual fact. So we have a notified body, we submit our documents over there, they look at the evidence. So for any single thing that we produce as a medical device, and any company in the space who is a declared medical device should give you the exact same answer, we have to submit all of this evidence. So this system that we've produced, I don't know if it actually exists. I've never seen it anywhere, but we were the first to kind of publish that this actually exists and this is what we do. But we can give live metrics of the accuracy of the system. That's how we can say this is the live observable precision rate. It's not 100%, as we've talked about. And to some extent with this architecture, it probably can never be theoretically. But the fact that we can observe, we can deploy a change, we can then observe, and then we can reassess and actually give that ability to the organizations, but we can prove that that's valid and that's required, that is the critical piece. The other critical piece is like when we make claims as a medical device, performance is X or productivity is Y. We have to have credible actual clinical investigation evidence for why those claims are thus. So, for example, we just ran the largest clinical trial for ambient voice technology in Europe, 17,000 patients, 9 clinical sites, human in the loop observations of every single encounter across that. It took about 6 to 12 months to run the entire study end to end across all the different settings. And then when we say, it saves X time, we can then evidence that that's where that comes from. So, and there's lots of sort of penalties if we put in our marketing claims something that the system can do that we don't have hard evidence to back up. And somebody, as I said, externally is verification. So it's not the labeling, it's not the mitigation of the risk. It's fundamentally, proving it, as scientists, what we do is what we say and what we say is what we do, which again is the fundamental criteria of being a medical professional. The other thing I'll also say is like when we want to add a new feature, we have to apply the same rigor. So even, for example, we're having a feature at the moment, we have to run a full clinical trial to apply for ethical approval, we have to get the IRS approved, we have to go through a rec. That's very different from the traditional software cycle. But again, it's about generating the evidence of why you've done something, what the intended use is, and what the problem statement is that you're trying to solve, and how you demonstrate that in the real world. And then again, somebody else checks that and takes liability for it as well as you do. So it's a very different mindset to, like a Cyber Essentials badge or something. It changes fundamentally everything that we do as a company. To give you a flavor of that, to a classification, it's about 100 documents. They all need to be maintained. And that's not an exaggeration. It is actually about 100 different documents. We have a 2-person compliance team. We have a specialist product and medical device teams that work on this day in and day out. It's a very, very different way of working than just slinging a couple of models together and getting Claude to do the UI and sticking it out there. And that's because of you have to prove it all the way down to the code base that it does what it says on the tin. And that's why we decided to become a medical device, because we thought it was quite a dangerous thing to do and that we wanted to reinforce it. And certainly the market has now moved that way. Did the results of previous experiments get fed in as training data? No. So maybe I didn't make that super clear. This was all about instruction fine-tuning. So the models themselves stayed the same. They were the same throughout. And what we were trying to demonstrate is actually changing the prompts does have a very significant impact on the performance of the output. I think there was a paper recently, and maybe someone else read it, that actually said the instruction that you give a model, the prompt, can meaningfully change the weights of the model. And there's a little bit of a sort of, in terms of how the transformer architecture attention biases actually work. I'll go find that paper and try and share it afterwards, but it is kind of validating what we already see. The prompt is as important in our view as the underlying model, which has been a debate for the last couple of years, but I think increasingly is definitely landing in that side. Victoria asks, you've understandably concentrated on the patient safety aspects of errors when creating your major minor systems. What about errors relating to privacy? Patients and doctors may discuss things other than the patient's health and treatment. Patients talking about a relative they're caring for, details about stresses or work, they shouldn't be included in notes. In some instances, these could be significant sensitive data. Imagine someone talking about the stress of a relative's diagnosis with HIV, for example. It's a really interesting question. We looked at this a lot when we started at Great Ormond Street. You could imagine there's a lot of sensitivity there because it's a quaternary pediatric environment. Some of the, information about mom or dad or marital status or a bunch of stuff. The problem with it is extremely subjective. So, for example, I'm a psychiatrist. I'm sitting with a patient, their husband's just been diagnosed with HIV. That actually is extremely relevant. Your care burden, the fact that they have a diagnosis that's potentially sexually transmitted, where did the HIV come from? This is actually extremely relevant to your diagnosis and should potentially, you could argue, be included in that note. That is the judgment of the clinician in the loop. So our sort of model has always been, in a clinical setting, in theory, everything is private, right? Like that's the whole point of patient-doctor confidentiality. What we build on the back end is we don't store any data, we don't retain, there's nothing in the cloud. We have some, don't train any models on patient data. So we're very, very sensitive to the patient piece. But what's included in the note has to remain the clinical judgment. In the same way that emissions is extremely subjective, what is sensitive and not sensitive and should or shouldn't be included in medical notes and committed to the record, I think remains actually quite a difficult challenge. And I certainly have found this challenge as a human clinician quite difficult in many, many circumstances. And I've always just written everything that I thought was pertinent that I would then have to defend later in court. But they are private records in the same way that any other private records are. I think the models themselves, it's a very difficult parameter. And the flip side of that is, we've seen this before with models discussing, the patient's sexual health. That's a very common problem that, especially earlier large language models were really difficult. They would often not want to talk about that because that was inherently part of their general guardrails from, if you used earlier versions of GPT from OpenAI, those safety guardrails would actually just not mention those things in the note when they're extremely pertinent. So I think actually the opposite problem is more, in our experience, an issue than the reverse. Victoria also asked, am I right that major errors are reported by sentence rather than by transcript? I suspect most doctors and patients would be interested in the error rate per consult. Yeah, 100%. And I think what we do now is because some consultations are 90 minutes and some consultations are 2, the way that we've calculated it is almost like by the number of entities. So how many facts and how many of them were correctly entailed and how many of them were incorrectly. And that's that precision metric. You can do it per consult, but a single error in a 90-minute consultation or a single error in a 2-minute consultation are actually very different levels of performance, but they both come out as errors of 1 per consult. So actually it becomes a little bit contextually specific, and it came apart when we tried to do it that way. Have you done any work on plugging reasoning models such as O3 into CREOLA? Yes and no. Not directly into CREOLA because some of the reasoning models actually sort of post-date that system, but certainly looking at their performance over time, they have their own drawbacks. Some of the newer models tended to hallucinate more than older models. Depending on the number of reasoning loops, you can see that now actually, even with some of the modern deep research, for example, it can be very hallucinatory because there's multiple different loops. But we haven't published anything, so it's an interesting open question and very happy to explore it with somebody. Used a limited set of transcripts. Can you talk about more of the nature of these transcripts? Do they cover more unusual diagnosis? Yeah, super good point. So the Primark dataset is open source, it's accessible, comes with audio. I would be wary about the transcripts. We had to hand correct them. There were lots of mistakes, so I wouldn't use the transcripts verbatim. But it is quite a small dataset. It's telephone consultations. It's very heavily DV. I mean, it's almost entirely primary care, but also very heavily skewed towards MSK. So again, the point of this was kind of to see can we define the system? Can we prompt iterate? Can we have the taxonomy? That's what we use to derive the future state system that is validated for that use cases. But generally, the use case here is the ground truth is the ground truth, right? The ground truth is the transcript. What's in the source should be in the output. What's in the output should be in the source. So actually, they could argue the diversity of data when you're not making diagnosis or asking the model to perform tasks like diagnose this patient and how does it cope with rare disease versus rare presentations of common disease. And that's a very common problem that LLMs really suffer with. But that's not our use case. So again, it's the definition of does that matter or not, but it's an open question. Does the data set need to be more diverse? And certainly can be looking at that as we progress. What's this one? The consultation with patient needs to chat. Yeah. Have you assessed how recent on-prem models perform to commercial? Yeah, super good, super good. So open source versus cloud source models. Hard to know actually. We haven't done any formal assessments, and again, something that we should look at. So reasonings or open source. But my general feeling is for this specific use case, in the last 6 to 12 months, open source has certainly got really performant and really quite good at it. Don't have any formal data, so I won't probably comment any more than that. You are saying LLM will always hallucinate, and that's the way they work, but more research into how they work should eliminate this issue. At least that's what Anthropic and OpenAI researchers are suggesting. Yeah, exactly. So there's been quite a plethora of research in the last month or so, looking at different strategies for why they hallucinate. So one is the reward function, which is obvious. They are primarily have been trained and reinforced to give complete answers and not to say, I don't know. And in fact, one of the earliest like reductions in hallucinations that we gave the system, this was going back 2 months ago and is well established in the literature, was you just say, if you don't know, just write not mentioned or not discussed or I don't know. And that's quite a common feature in most of these systems now because that did actually help. And that's kind of pointing towards the retraining of models, but that's maybe not as, what's the word, as robust because obviously that's just in the prompt level as opposed to in the actual weights. We're seeing some interesting research now about the probabilities of each token and just cutting off chains of probabilities when they're relatively low confidence. That could also help. And as I said, there are also different architectures for this use case. I'd say in general, though, the concept of using a single large language model to do any important task is very much like just sitting on your car engine. Like, don't do it because your bum will get burnt and you won't go anywhere. That's my favorite statement. But the concept really is like we have to start building the car. It's the system architecture that's important. You've got to build the brakes and the steering and the sat nav and the I run out of car things, radiators, I guess, axles, whatever. So like, and the seats as well. So it's all about the user experience, how the outputs are presented, at what point the human clinician takes over, at what point the AI drives it. The model in and of itself may only and should only be a part of a wider system, and the wider system should have independent components. Even with the best research in the world about why they hallucinate, I still think it's inherently flawed to have a one shot. It just doesn't appeal to my clinician brain. Like even when we need to do something really important, like cross-match blood, for example, we send two samples. Why do we do that, right? The tests are great, they're validated, etc. But we know that errors creep into the system. We should start having that same approach here and think about the system level, not just the model functionality. How do you collaborate with doctors? Yeah, so we have labeling, we have external, internal. We've had a different mix of different things at the moment. We've used labeling platforms. We've also used internal systems. We have an intern program. Had a couple of great interns come through that. So by all means, look out for that. What medical device class is Tortus? We're class 1 on our way to class 2. Thanks for the presentation. Have you looked at experimented with presenting confidence levels, quality metrics alongside the output to the user at the point of use? That is a super good question. We have, but it's very difficult. So it's already so the idea of this technology, right, is to save time. So the more you give the clinician to review after the consultation. So at one point we were like, yeah, the clinician should read the transcript. But that's like a whole, as a 30-minute consultation, that's 4,000 words roughly. Suddenly they're going to read the whole transcript and then they're going to read the note. It's an unrealistic premise. The same thing with like potentially presenting low confidence areas to check or to review. I think the more that we can take care of automated and external and internally validated and present that to clinician to review at carte blanche, there are some things that we would have high confidence on. For example, we'd have high confidence that ivermectin was definitely said in the transcript because when you read the transcript, it says the patient's on ivermectin. The fact that the model, the speech to text model misheard and actually the patient takes ivabradine, we have no sight of, right? Because we don't know that chain of provenance at that point of confidence. So presenting these errors is not straightforward. I think we have looked at certain things like, are we confident about drug names? Are we confident about diagnoses? Can we hear the patient consistently? Like there's lots of quality metrics, and we're kind of digging into a little bit more about the provenance. So if we, in that analogy, for example, like did we have high confidence that word was that word? And should we have thresholds around that? But it's a very fine balance because, I can produce a zero hallucination system today. It will have no output, right? So like you can, archetype all sorts of different models to reduce the error rate, but there's a trade-off against usability. And ultimately, if the clinician's not going to use it, then actually you have not achieved anything other than a super safe system that's just a pure academic exercise. So from a UX perspective, it's very tricky, but it is something that we're working on. Helena says, thank you very much. Can you provide more details on the technical safeguard guardrails that you would expect to be included when fine-tuning the off-the-shelf models for the specific task? No, they're mostly IP based, but I think the essential point is how you detect what facts are in the output versus where they came from, the provenance of the data, that is critical. And then being able to serve that back in real time, also critical. So you can observe when changes are made, when there's different changes in model behavior, when there's a hardware problem, which can produce some very strange outputs that we wouldn't normally anticipate. A GPU going rampant. We've seen it once in about 2 years, but it does happen and the outputs are very abnormal. So you have to have all these sort of inbuilt systems to be able to detect that. There's certain error types that happen that we can sort of make sure that they're just sort of deterministic. No, we don't do that. Yeah, a lot of it is sort of secret source, so I can't do too into it. Post-launch, do you utilize the feedback from clinicians when they check the clinical notes to feed it back to the model to iterative increase performance? Yes. So not so much to increase performance because we're not training a lot of models ourselves, but certainly a big issue of deploying these systems in the real world is that the errors come back to you, but you often don't get anywhere near the data to actually debug. So a really common was is like, oh yeah, the output was really weird. And that's the feedback we get. And it's just like, well, why was it weird? Like, was there an error? Was it a style? Was it a template problem? Was it a hallucination? Was that hallucination critical? Was it actually what you said? Sometimes what we find is people are, I never said that. And then we look at the transcript and they actually did say that. So I didn't come back to this, but the human baseline of observation of what we're doing is a missing piece of this research. And we've done a little bit in-house. We accidentally fed human notes and transcripts. So humans listening to transcripts and writing their own notes. These are all human clinicians, mostly SHO junior reg level. We fed that data into our labeling system. Human beings in that study, although we never published it because it was super ropey, but they did hallucinate about 7% of the time. And the hallucination rate for humans was actually very similar to large language models. A classic one that I always remember, one of the doctors wrote no PMB, no PCB, so no postmenopausal bleeding, no postcoital bleeding. But the patient was 32. There's no mention of menopause. They'd actually asked about postcoital bleeding, but they'd just written the acronym because they were used to it, which is exactly the same, tends to be the subtle hallucinations that large language models have. So are we all just large language models? Open question, next debate. But I think the critical piece here is like, oh, and actually the emission rate was 10%. So they were missing important facts about 10% of the time. And I actually think that's very true so I used to do my letters at nighttime. I would check them, review them, and write them on my night shifts. And I always thought I was doing an amazing job. And then I stopped doing that a few weeks later when I read back some of the letters that I'd sent out. They made like no sense. And at the time I thought, oh, these are great letters, they're super well composed. But I was like 2 a.m., two stabbies into the shift, trying to do another one before the next one came. And honestly, like my performance and cognitive load was so far off baseline, and I had no idea. And I think one of the really interesting things about this technology is AI checking human performance as well as human checking AI. And we haven't really got into that state of play at the minute. But I think that's the missing piece. What is the human doing today? Because that's part of the justification for these error rates. Like if we're 10x better than a human, but we're not 100%, that's a very safe and reasonable ROI. If we're like not even that much better or even in fact worse, then that shouldn't be on the shelves. And that's the sort of piece that I think is missing from a lot of this research. You say it saves time, but did you just look at the narrow situation of the wider system? I'm thinking of failure demand where errors have to be sorted out by other people in the system. Yeah, that's pretty important. I mean, you may have seen this. There was an article in fortune.com recently. A whole AI letter was hallucinated, different company, obviously, committed to the record. Patient was called for diabetes screen. So suddenly errors in the system were compounding. My view is A, there's a clinician in the loop. B, you have to have these monitoring systems to be able to prove, like, a hallucination rate of 100% should just be a non-starter. Like, nobody should be deploying that to the system. But again, a big gap is provenance. Once something is committed to the record in the current EHR data models that we have no way of telling if it was AI or human generated. That is a critical problem now because we need to know downstream what confidence we should have. Did the human consultant write this or did the AI generated and it wasn't reviewed and we don't know the parlance between the two? There's lots we can do to make that clinician AI interaction better. But in my view, I think there needs to be a data model underlying it that allows us to sort of check those systems. At the moment, when the clinician's checking it, downstream errors, etc., they don't, they shouldn't, in theory, in the intended use system, be there. But we need to be able to track that. And again, I think that's something that's partly lacking. There's
Dom,
loads of questions. I
just
think we
to
might
go
run out of
on,
time.
I'm conscious we're going to kind of draw to a close at 1, and there's a couple of questions in there as well about the patient's views. I know you're diligently working through, and it's brilliant. I want to make sure that we capture that view, which brings in a different question about what are patients' thoughts on this, and are patients involved in, I think Rhonda has one in there about being part of a tripartite relationship between patient, clinician and tool, and your reflections on that.
Yeah, I mean, so it was. I mean, we had patient surveys for all the trials, in terms of patient experience and what they thought. Generally, on par or better than most of their previous experiences. But I think most interesting is it was our single biggest fit. So pre-launch, going back about 2 years ago now, we're like, oh, what do patients think? No one wants to be listened to. Everyone's very paranoid about the AI in the system. So we had leaflets and we had patient assistant things. And I have to say, paradoxically, we were most wrong about this. And the reason I think we were most wrong about this is, we all have a fear of being listened to in our daily life, but where in the world do you have the biggest fear that you won't be listened to? And that's when you're in front of the doctor, that you're not being heard. And suddenly, here's the clinician, and they're like, well, here's my AI. It's going to capture every word. Here's a special fancy microphone. You wear that. It's not going to miss a single thing. One of our GP colleagues has now used it for, I think, about 15 months, has seen about 7,500 patients, maybe 8,000 at this point. He printed out a patient information leaflet. He says, I'm using this system. Do you want any more information? Only one patient has actually asked to see that leaflet in 15 months' time. So patient acceptance is super high. I mean, they trust you that, you've done the assurances and you're trusted and you're installed in the system. They trust that the data is being handled correctly in the same way that it is in the EHR. But generally, people find it much better. And obviously, eye contact, more human to human contact. What's really interesting, actually, in our first trials, the system wasn't very good. Again, going back quite a while ago. And when we monitored it, the typing time between the clinician doing their own typing and the AI was actually the same. And we were like, oh, because they're doing loads of edits. But we still saw a 25% reduction in the time taken overall. And we're like, well, how do we explain that? Because they're still typing the same amount. And then we looked back at it. When you interrupt the patient, it's a far less efficient form of communication. So previously, people were like, one sec, one sec, one sec, as you're trying to type, and that kept interrupting their flow. And actually, when we took that away, patients are actually just much more efficient communicators because they could just get it all out and it was all captured. And even if you had to edit, you still saved a bunch of time. So thus far, it's been very good from experience. From a problems perspective, it's an unknown. Don't know. I think that's something that we're still working.
Lovely. Thanks ever so much, Dom. I know I think we're going to run out of time to get down to the end of the questions, but we'll try and maybe collect some of those up and as well too. But I really it's just been fantastic. It's been I've just let you run with it. Because it's just wonderful to hear the as Miriam said there, the kind of the thoroughness of it, and that kind of very conscious understanding of these tools are part of. I really liked your car analogy, part of the system architecture, bringing regulators, clinicians, patients, everybody into that round. I was trying to jot down some of the challenges you were setting out and capture some of them, and there's it'd be wonderful to at another time catch up on that question about reliance bias you're reflecting on, and the other one about the quality of the grounded truth, the quality of that human baseline as well too, because we're comparing it back. Where does that grounded truth sit? So really, really fascinating. Before we go, I wanted to let everybody know we've got another presentation, and our next meeting in October. No, is it? Yes, it is October. I don't know if Emma's there. Emma has the details. There we go. Where Steve Nider from the Touring will be talking about something completely different. The kind of working towards digital twins of cardiovascular studies. Really interesting in that area as well too. But really, just to say a huge thank you to Dom. It has been wonderful to have you with us, and thank you so much everybody as well that's contributed to all your questions and thinking about this. It's a really fascinating space, and one that will just grow and grow and grow, and it's just been really fantastic. So thanks, Dom.
No, thanks all. Fantastic. Always to chat. And I've left my email in the chat if anyone wants to drop me an email.
Oh, brilliant. Even better. So sorry to those that we didn't get through all the questions. But yes, drop Dom a line. You'll be inundated now. Any time you've saved from your commute, Dom will be.
Yeah, I've got some time today, right? So I'll spend.
Yes. Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone, and have a lovely afternoon. Lovely to see you all. Bye. Thanks, Emma.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.